Names tell stories. What is your name? What does it mean? You may have a story behind your name. There are often stories and meanings behind people's names. We can also find some background stories of food names and place names. These stories behind names often tell us interesting historical facts. Place names. Studying the origins of place names is an interesting way to learn about history. For example, many city names on the East Coast of the US tell us about those cities' colonial history. When the original settlers arrived in the new land, they often named their new settlements after their hometowns. They wanted a name that reminded them of the hometowns they left behind. For instance, the former name of New York was New Amsterdam. It was the Dutch who first came to this new land, and they named their new city in memory of a city in Holland. Later, New Amsterdam was changed into New York when the British took over the land. The British renamed the city New York after York, a town in northern England. Many city names on the West Coast, on the other hand, reflect the fact that the early settlers in this area were Spanish. Los Angeles, the Angels, and Las Vegas, the Valleys, are examples of Spanish city names. There are also many cities whose names start with San, a Spanish word meaning saint. Cities such as San Francisco, San Diego, and San Jose were named after famous Catholic saints by Spanish settlers. Food names. Food names often have interesting stories behind them. Do you like hamburgers? Hamburgers have now become one of the most popular foods in the world. There have been quite a few historical stories about where hamburgers originated from. One of the most popular stories tells us that hamburgers began with the Mongols. While the Mongols were traveling on their horses to conquer the world, they kept beef or other meat under the saddles. The meat turned into flat patties as it was sandwiched between the saddle and the horse's back. The meat became tender enough to eat raw. Later, as the trade increased in the world, this idea was brought to Hamburg, Germany. German people cook the meat patties in the shape of a steak, and the food was then known as Hamburg steak. When this food got to America early in the 19th century, somehow it was put between two slices of bread. People call this new food hamburger. There is also an interesting story behind the words beef and pork. Have you ever wondered why people say beef steak instead of cow steak and pork cutlet instead of pig cutlet? In English, the words beef and pork are used to refer to the meats of the animals cow and pig. The story is traced back to the time of the Norman conquest of England. In 1066, there was a very important event in the history of the English language. The Duke of Normandy, William the Conqueror, invaded England. After that, England was ruled by the French for almost a century. The French people killed most of the English noble class and made the English commoners their servants. The English commoners spoke English while the French noble class spoke French. Thus, two languages were spoken in one country at the same time. It was the English commoners who looked after the livestock. They called the animals cow and pig because these were their English names. However, when their meat was served on the dinner table for the French noble class, they were called bœuf and porc, which later became the English words beef and pork. People's names. People's names also reflect the important part of history. We can find a good example from the names of African Americans. According to the U.S. Census, the blackest last name in America is Washington. About 9 out of 10 people that have Washington as their last name are African Americans. Why is the name Washington so popular among African Americans? The answer goes back to their sad history of slavery. The slaves often didn't have a last name. After the American Civil War, freed slaves needed their own last names and had to choose their names for themselves. Washington was one of their popular choices. It was because George Washington was the only president to free his slaves among the 12 presidents who owned slaves. Another popular last name for African Americans is Howard. Many blacks chose this name after General Oliver O. Howard, who fought for the freedom of the slaves during the American Civil War. History is a story of people, that is, our stories of living over the ages. These stories are reflected in the names of many things, such as names of places, food, and people. Tracing the origins of the names provides us with not only interesting facts, but also an important insight in understanding history.